When we think of the Wild West, most of us picture the same scene: a dusty frontier town, wooden buildings lined along a single dirt road, and a sheriff standing tall with a gleaming star pinned to his vest. Hollywood made us believe that law and order was just a duel away, that justice was swift, righteous, and delivered by men of honor. But the truth? The reality of law in the Wild West was far darker, far bloodier, and far less organized than most people ever imagine. In most frontier towns, law enforcement barely existed. Sheriffs were elected, often not because of their skill, but because they were popular, wealthy, or simply intimidating enough to scare others into voting for them. Marshals were sent by the federal government, but they covered territories so vast it was impossible to patrol effectively. Imagine one marshal tasked with maintaining peace over hundreds of miles of rugged, hostile land. It was an impossible job from the very start. This vacuum of authority created a society where violence became the default form of justice. If someone stole your horse, there was little chance an officer of the law would catch him. Instead, your neighbors might gather, ride out as a posse, and either bring him back, alive, or more often, dead. And if the accused even made it back to town, there wasn't always a court waiting for him. Instead, there was a tree, a rope, and a crowd ready to see justice done immediately. Public hangings became a grim form of entertainment. People gathered not just to watch justice being carried out, but to celebrate it like a carnival. Vendors sold food, children watched with wide eyes, and communities cheered as the condemned man fell. In the absence of law, brutality turned into spectacle. And yet, this so-called justice was far from fair. Often, it wasn't the guilty who ended up at the end of the rope. Accusations alone were enough to condemn a man. A single rumor of theft, or even being in the wrong place at the wrong time, could lead to a death sentence without trial. In towns where power belonged to a handful of influential ranchers or businessmen, vigilante justice became a tool of control, silencing rivals and keeping ordinary settlers terrified into obedience. Outlaws flourished in this climate of weak law enforcement. We often remember the names of Jesse James, Billy the Kid, or Butch Cassidy, romanticized as rebels who outsmarted the law. But in reality, outlaws thrived because there was little law to stop them. Banks, trains, and stagecoaches were tempting targets, and gangs roamed freely knowing sheriffs were outgunned and outnumbered. For every legendary outlaw we remember today, there were countless others who robbed, killed, and vanished into the vast frontier, leaving no record but the fear they carved into those who survived. It wasn't only gangs and criminals. Ordinary disputes between neighbors could turn violent in an instant. Arguments over property lines, cattle grazing rights, or unpaid debts often escalated into shootouts. In some towns, murder rates soared to levels that would shock us even by today's standards. In Dodge City, Kansas, during its rowdiest years, the murder rate was estimated at over 10 times higher than that of modern-day Chicago. Vigilante groups formed everywhere, and while some began with good intentions, to protect their communities, they often evolved into ruthless mobs. Once unleashed, they were almost impossible to control. Entire families could be targeted for the alleged crimes of one member. Settlers who were new to town, or immigrants who didn't speak English well, became easy scapegoats. And if you crossed the wrong man, someone wealthier, someone better connected, you might wake up to find a mob outside your door. Perhaps one of the darkest aspects of this so-called frontier justice was how it blurred the line between hero and criminal. Sheriffs and marshals themselves weren't always noble figures. Many were corrupt, violent, or even outright criminals wearing a badge. Some took bribes to look the other way when outlaws operated. Others enforced the law selectively, protecting the wealthy while punishing the poor. And a few sheriffs built reputations as killers, men who wore the star but were feared as much as any outlaw. Take Wild Bill Hickok, for example. Today, he's remembered as a legendary lawman, gambler, and gunslinger. But Hickok himself killed numerous men in questionable circumstances, sometimes in self-defense, sometimes not. His reputation kept people in check, but it also blurred the question, was he upholding the law, or simply surviving in a place where violence was the only language everyone understood? Justice in the Wild West was not about fairness. It was about survival, dominance, and fear. And ordinary settlers lived with that reality every day. They locked their doors at night, kept their rifles close, and trusted no one but their family. In many towns, the only law was the one you made for yourself. But perhaps the most chilling truth of all is this: even in places that eventually established proper courts and jails, the culture of vigilante justice never disappeared. Lynchings continued well into the late 19th century, targeting not just suspected criminals, but minorities, immigrants, and anyone deemed an outsider. For African Americans, Chinese laborers, and Native Americans living near frontier towns, the threat of sudden, mob-driven violence hung constantly in the air. When you peel back the myths of the Wild West, what you find is not the world of noble sheriffs and quick-draw duels. Instead, you find a place where law was fragile, justice was twisted, and survival depended on fear. The frontier was not tamed by honor, but by blood. And for those who lived there, the brutal truth was simple: the law was whatever the strongest man said it was. If lawlessness defined the Wild West, then violence was its heartbeat. Every dusty street, every saloon, and every lonely stretch of prairie carried with it the possibility of sudden, brutal death. Forget the clean, choreographed duels of Hollywood films. The reality was bloodier, messier, and far more unpredictable. Contrary to what legends suggest, most gunfights weren't duels at high noon. Rarely did two men square off in the middle of town to settle a score with an audience watching in silence. Instead, violence often came without warning. A drunken insult in a saloon could spark a brawl that ended with pistols fired in the chaos. A poker game gone wrong could leave bodies slumped across a gambling table. And disputes over debts, women, or cattle often ended in sudden ambushes, one man reaching for his revolver while the other never had a chance to draw. This constant threat of violence shaped the very psychology of frontier life. Settlers walked through towns armed to the teeth, rifles slung over shoulders, pistols strapped to belts, knives hidden beneath coats. To live without a weapon was to invite death. It wasn't about being an outlaw, it was about staying alive in a place where arguments were settled with bullets, not words. The violence wasn't limited to personal disputes. Cattle rustling, for example, was rampant across the plains. A single stolen steer could spark deadly feuds between rival ranchers. Entire groups of armed men would gather to reclaim stolen herds, often leading to bloody clashes where casualties were inevitable. And unlike the romanticized cattle drives seen in films, these were dangerous, lawless affairs. Cowboys faced stampedes, bandits, and rival ranchers who were more than willing to kill over grazing rights. Then there were the infamous range wars, extended conflicts between cattle barons, sheep herders, and farmers competing for the same land. The Johnson County War in Wyoming is perhaps the most notorious example, where wealthy cattle companies hired mercenaries to wipe out small ranchers accused of rustling. Dozens were killed in these feuds, yet the perpetrators were rarely punished. In the end, might made right, and the land went to whoever could shed the most blood. Even towns that prided themselves on civility weren't immune. Dodge City, Tombstone, Deadwood, names we remember today as iconic Western outposts, were once hotbeds of violence. Drunken shootouts erupted in saloons almost weekly. Gambling dens became slaughterhouses when tempers flared. And in some towns, the morgue filled faster than the church pews. Statistically, the frontier was staggeringly violent. In the 1870s and 1880s, the murder rate in many frontier towns was 10 to 15 times higher than the U.S. average today. To put that in perspective, a small settlement of just a few hundred people might see several murders in a single month. And these weren't isolated killings, they were woven into the fabric of daily life. But violence wasn't confined to towns and ranches. The expansion westward meant constant clashes with Native American tribes who were defending their homelands. Raids, ambushes, and massacres marked the landscape with blood. Settlers lived in fear of attacks on wagon trains or isolated homesteads, while native communities lived with the terror of sudden military retaliation. Each side viewed the other as invaders, and the result was a cycle of violence that scarred generations. For many settlers, violence was both a threat and a grim necessity. Families kept rifles at the ready not only for hunting but for fending off raiders, rustlers, or desperate drifters. Teaching children how to handle a firearm wasn't a choice, it was survival training. Life on the frontier demanded readiness to kill at a moment's notice, and those who hesitated often paid with their lives. It wasn't just men caught in this web of brutality. Women, too, lived under its shadow. Domestic violence was rampant, and the isolation of frontier life meant few avenues for protection or justice. Saloon girls and prostitutes endured not just exploitation but also frequent assaults, sometimes killed by drunken customers without consequence. The law rarely defended them, their lives were considered expendable in the larger scheme of frontier survival. Perhaps the most disturbing element of frontier violence was its casual acceptance. In modern times, a killing might dominate headlines for weeks. In the Wild West, it was Tuesday. Violence was so common that newspapers often reported shootings in just a few lines, buried beneath stories about crop yields or railroad expansions. Death became ordinary, and brutality became background noise. And yet, amid this constant bloodshed, a strange culture of reputation grew. Men who survived gunfights, whether fair or foul, gained notoriety. A reputation for violence could be as valuable as gold. It meant fewer people would dare cross you. The most feared gunmen often didn't need to draw their weapons at all, their names alone kept others in check. Violence wasn't just survival, it was currency. But reputations were fragile. One mistake, one unlucky moment, and even the most feared gunslinger could end up face down in the dirt. That was the paradox of frontier violence. No matter how many fights you won, death was always just one draw away. When we strip away the Hollywood illusions, what we see is a world where violence was not the exception, but the rule. It wasn't about dramatic duels under the desert sun, it was about messy brawls, drunken shootings, bloody feuds, and the ever-present specter of sudden death. The brutal truth is simple: in the Wild West, life was cheap. Disputes that today might end in lawsuits or arguments over social media were settled then with bullets. And for the men and women who lived it, violence wasn't a story. It was their daily reality, a reality that defined the frontier far more than the myths we remember today. The romanticized image of the Wild West often skips over one of the harshest realities of frontier life: disease was everywhere, and medicine was scarce, crude, and often deadly. While cowboys rode across endless plains and towns celebrated gunfights, most settlers lived in squalor, surrounded by filth, disease, and desperation. What Hollywood ignores is that, in many ways, the battle for survival wasn't against outlaws, it was against invisible enemies that could strike silently, swiftly, and fatally. Sanitation was nearly non-existent. Towns sprang up overnight, without proper planning, drainage, or sewage systems. Waste often piled in the streets, mixing with dust, mud, and the runoff from livestock. Open wells and contaminated water sources spread cholera, typhoid, and dysentery. Children played in the dirt, unaware that every step could bring infection. A single sip of water or bite of food could mean the difference between life and death. Doctors were rare, and their knowledge limited. Frontier physicians had little training, and many learned their craft through trial and error, or sheer luck. Surgical procedures were primitive, with no anesthesia or proper sterilization. Broken bones were set with crude splints, infected wounds were lanced and drained without antibiotics, because antibiotics didn't exist. Infections that today are treatable often proved fatal. Amputations were common, and mortality rates were staggering. Diseases like tuberculosis, smallpox, and influenza spread with terrifying speed. Entire families could be wiped out in weeks. Unlike urban areas in the East, where hospitals or specialized care existed, frontier towns relied on home remedies, herbal concoctions, and faith. People prayed, applied poultices, and hoped. Many didn't survive. Graveyards in these settlements filled with children and adults alike, their graves unmarked, a silent testament to the deadly randomness of disease. Pregnancy and childbirth were particularly dangerous. Women gave birth at home, often assisted by relatives or midwives with minimal experience. Complications were common, and without proper care, maternal and infant mortality rates were astronomical. A woman's life could be lost to a simple infection, and newborns often did not survive their first year. The frontier demanded courage, but courage could not protect against germs. Even minor injuries carried a lethal risk. A simple cut while working the fields, tending cattle, or chopping wood could become gangrenous or infected, leading to sepsis. Many settlers carried knives, but these were more often tools than protection. Accidents were inevitable, and medical help was rarely close by. What seems trivial today, a scraped knee or a puncture wound, could easily end a life in the Wild West. Mental health, too, was an overlooked struggle. The constant threat of violence, isolation, and disease took a toll on settlers' minds. Depression, anxiety, and grief were commonplace, yet rarely recognized. There were no support systems, no therapists, no treatment. People coped as best they could, through alcohol, prayer, or sheer stoicism, often masking the toll that the harsh frontier exacted on their mental well-being. Frontier towns were also vulnerable to epidemics. Smallpox could sweep through a settlement in days. Entire towns quarantined themselves when possible, but containment was often impossible. Railroads and stagecoaches, which promised connection to the outside world, also became vectors for disease. Migrants and travelers unknowingly carried infections across the plains, spreading illness faster than communities could react. Medicine itself was often more harmful than helpful. Patent medicines, advertised as cure-alls, were loaded with alcohol, opium, or toxic chemicals. People willingly consumed these mixtures, believing they were treating fevers, coughs, or digestive problems, often making conditions worse. Quack doctors roamed from town to town, promising miraculous cures for everything from snakebites to cholera. Many families, desperate for hope, paid whatever they could for these false remedies, only to lose loved ones anyway. The combination of filth, lack of sanitation, and poor medical knowledge meant that life expectancy on the frontier was alarmingly low. While some hardy individuals survived into old age, most settlers faced a constant dance with death. Survival was measured not in years but in weeks, days, and sometimes hours. Every cough, every fever, every small wound was a reminder that life was fragile and fleeting. Children were especially vulnerable. Malnutrition, infectious diseases, and harsh living conditions led to high infant mortality rates. Funerals for young children were frequent and tragic events, and families carried on, often having more children to replace the ones they lost. The frontier was unforgiving, and innocence offered no protection. Yet, amid this grim reality, settlers adapted. They learned which rivers were safe to drink from, which herbs could soothe pain, and how to isolate the sick to prevent entire families from dying. Communities formed around mutual aid, sharing whatever limited knowledge and resources they had. But these measures were temporary defenses against relentless threats. In essence, the Wild West was a landscape dominated by death as much as by lawlessness. Violence and outlaws captured imaginations, but disease, filth, and lack of medicine were far more consistent killers. Hollywood romanticizes the thrill of a gunfight, but a cough, a cut, or a contaminated well was often more lethal than any pistol. Survival required more than courage, it demanded luck, resilience, and constant vigilance. When we examine the reality of frontier life, it becomes clear, the West was not just wild because of its guns and outlaws, it was wild because every day was a battle against invisible enemies that could strike without warning. The harsh truths of disease and filth remind us that the frontier was not a land of opportunity for everyone. For most, it was a place where the line between life and death was thin, and fate often cruelly decided who would survive. If disease and violence defined the Wild West, then the living conditions made survival an almost daily battle. Hollywood may show frontier towns as quaint wooden streets and cozy cabins, but the truth is far harsher. Settlers endured dust storms, freezing winters, suffocating summers, and homes barely fit for shelter. Life in the West was a test of endurance, where comfort was a luxury few could afford, and despair was a constant companion. Most settlers did not live in the charming log cabins often depicted in films. The majority resided in sod houses, crude wooden shacks, or tents, hastily built to withstand the harsh climate. Sod houses were little more than mud walls reinforced with grass and dirt. They leaked in the rain, offered minimal insulation against freezing winters, and were infested with insects and rodents. Wood, the material most settlers dreamed of, was often scarce, forcing families to improvise with what little they could find. Dust was a relentless enemy. Prairie winds swept across the plains, carrying fine particles that infiltrated every home, every bed, and every meal. Settlers' clothes, dishes, and furniture were coated in a layer of dust that never seemed to settle. Dust storms could last for days, reducing visibility to almost nothing, making travel hazardous and forcing families to stay indoors in suffocating, choking conditions. Imagine children coughing in dusty corners while mothers fought to sweep dirt and debris from their fragile shelters. Summers brought scorching heat, while winters brought snow, ice, and bone-chilling cold. Fires were essential, yet wood was limited and often damp, producing little warmth. Many families huddled in small rooms, wrapped in whatever cloth or animal hides they could find, desperately trying to survive the freezing nights. Hypothermia and frostbite were constant threats, and even a single night without adequate heat could prove fatal for children or the elderly. Food scarcity added another layer of desperation. Settlers relied on what they could grow, hunt, or preserve, but crop failures, droughts, or infestations could wipe out entire harvests. When food ran low, families resorted to spoiled meat, roots, or even insects. Malnutrition weakened the body, making settlers more susceptible to disease, infection, and exhaustion. For many, hunger was not a temporary inconvenience, it was a constant, gnawing companion that shadowed every day. Sanitation was another brutal reality. With no indoor plumbing, families used outhouses, dugouts, or nearby streams, often contaminating drinking water in the process. Waste and filth were a part of daily life, and hygiene was nearly impossible to maintain. Settlers' bodies, clothing, and homes reeked of smoke, sweat, and the ever-present dust of the plains. Washing was a luxury, a rare occurrence reserved for major events or visitors, rather than a daily habit. Isolation compounded these hardships. Many families lived miles from the nearest neighbor or town. A trip to get supplies could take days on horseback, across rough terrain teeming with wild animals and dangerous weather. Children often roamed the plains unsupervised, learning survival skills early, or paying the ultimate price for mistakes. Illness, injury, or attacks could strike without warning, leaving families completely alone to cope. Animals, both domestic and wild, were constant intruders in daily life. Settlers' homes were often shared with chickens, pigs, or cows, which kept vermin away from their food but contributed to disease and filth. Wolves, bears, and coyotes threatened livestock and occasionally humans. Even horses, essential for transportation, required daily care and could not be taken for granted. A sick or lost horse could mean disaster for a family relying on it for survival. Despite these hardships, some settlers tried to create small comforts. Homemade furniture, quilts, and simple decorations gave homes a sense of normalcy. But these attempts were fragile against the relentless assault of weather, pests, and scarcity. Every comfort came with labor and sacrifice, and often, it was temporary. A single storm or drought could undo months of hard work in an instant. Children endured the brunt of these brutal conditions. They woke early to fetch water, tend animals, or help in the fields. Education was often sporadic, limited to one-room schoolhouses or a parent's instruction. Play was dangerous, survival was mandatory, and many children learned the harsh truths of life before reaching their teens. Mortality was high, and childhood was often cut short by accident, illness, or exposure. Yet, despite the misery, settlers adapted. They developed resourcefulness, inventiveness, and resilience that allowed them to endure what would break most people. They learned which crops could survive drought, which materials provided better insulation, and how to navigate the dangers of extreme weather. But even with these skills, life in the Wild West was rarely comfortable or safe. It was a constant struggle against the environment itself. The brutal living conditions also shaped the culture and mentality of the frontier. People became tough, suspicious, and fiercely independent. Trust was hard to come by, because survival demanded vigilance at every turn. And while stories of courage and resilience are celebrated, they often hide a darker truth. Life in the West was relentless, unforgiving, and deeply unforgiving to those who faltered. In the end, the dirt, dust, and desperation of frontier living were more than obstacles, they were defining characteristics of the Wild West. They forged a generation that could survive unimaginable hardship, but at tremendous cost. Childhoods were stolen, families broken, and comfort was a fleeting dream. For those who lived it, the West was not a land of adventure, it was a place where every day was a fight to simply endure. When most people think of the Wild West, the image that comes to mind is that of the cowboy, rugged, fearless, riding across endless plains, quick with a gun, and loyal to a strict code of honor. Movies and novels have painted cowboys as romantic figures, embodying freedom and adventure. But the truth about cowboys is far more gritty, dangerous, and unglamorous than the legends suggest. For starters, most cowboys were far from the wealthy, heroic figures Hollywood portrays. They were young men, often between the ages of 16 and 25, and the majority were poor or came from marginalized communities. A significant number were African American, Mexican, or Native American, yet their contributions have been largely erased from mainstream history. These men were often called vaqueros in the Southwest, and they brought vital skills in cattle handling that would shape cowboy culture, but their stories rarely made it into the dime novels and later films. Pay was miserable. Cowboys earned about $25-40 a month, barely enough to cover food, clothing, and equipment. Long cattle drives offered no extra compensation for the risk and grueling labor involved. A single misstep could mean being trampled by cattle, falling from a horse, or suffering injuries that left a man permanently disabled, with no safety net or compensation. The work was relentless, 16-hour days under scorching sun or freezing rain, with little rest and constant danger. Life on the trail was not glamorous. Cowboys slept on the ground, often with nothing more than a blanket or a bedroll. They ate simple, repetitive meals, beans, bacon, coffee, and whatever they could hunt along the way. Fresh vegetables were rare, and spoiled food was a constant threat, bringing illness to already exhausted men. Hygiene was minimal, bathing was a rare luxury, and lice, fleas, and other pests were constant companions. The danger wasn't limited to labor. Violence and lawlessness followed cowboys wherever they went. Stagecoach robberies, ambushes by outlaws, and disputes over land and cattle meant a cowboy's life was constantly on the line. Many met their end far from towns, either by accident, disease, or violent confrontation. Hollywood duels at high noon are few and far between, the real threat was random, sudden, and often deadly. Cowboys were also at the mercy of the land itself. The open plains and rugged terrain were unforgiving. Rivers could sweep away horses and men, stampedes could crush the unwary, and storms could leave a trail of death and destruction. Survival required constant vigilance, courage, and instinct, but even the most experienced cowboy could fall victim to the environment. Social life for cowboys was rough and solitary. Many were young men far from home, without families or stable communities. Loneliness was common, and companionship was often found in the saloon or around a campfire. Alcohol and gambling became both entertainment and escape, offering brief relief from the harsh realities of life on the trail. But indulgence carried risk, fights were frequent, and violence could erupt over the smallest slight. Yet, despite the hardship, cowboys developed a strong code of conduct, not a code of honor dictated by law, but a practical guide to surviving in a world full of danger. Loyalty to fellow cowhands, respect for skilled work, and careful handling of cattle were essential. A cowboy who broke this code often faced ostracism, ridicule, or worse, from his peers. Survival depended as much on cooperation as on individual toughness. Many cowboys died young. Accidents, disease, and violence claimed lives in their 20s or early 30s. Rarely did a cowboy enjoy the decades-long adventures depicted in novels and films. Those who survived often retired to modest farms or ranches, far from the romanticized adventures of their youth. The legends of the fearless, untouchable gunslinger often overshadow the reality of a short, grueling life filled with labor, hardship, and constant risk. Women and minorities played crucial but overlooked roles in cowboy culture. African American cowboys, for instance, made up roughly 1 in 4 cowhands after the Civil War. They brought essential skills, knowledge of livestock, and resilience under extreme conditions, yet their stories were largely erased from popular culture. Similarly, Mexican vaqueros influenced every aspect of cowboy life, from roping techniques to riding styles, yet they remain largely invisible in the romanticized narrative of the American West. Cattle drives themselves were brutal. Men rode for weeks or months, covering hundreds of miles with thousands of animals. They faced exhaustion, storms, disease among the herd, and occasional attacks from outlaws or rival ranchers. Night watches were constant, with cowboys taking turns guarding the herd from predators and thieves. A single lapse could mean the loss of hundreds of animals, and, with them, the cowboy's livelihood. It wasn't just physical endurance that defined cowboys, it was also mental toughness. Isolation, monotony, and uncertainty required a certain resilience. Long stretches of silence on the open plains tested patience and willpower, while the constant presence of danger kept adrenaline and anxiety high. Cowboys needed to think quickly, act decisively, and trust in both their skills and their instincts to survive. Despite the myths, there were few lone gunslinger heroes. Cowboys were part of communities, bound by necessity and survival. They depended on each other for protection, work, and companionship. They were far more craftsmen and laborers than the romanticized gunfighters that dominate films and books. The real cowboy was not a legend, they were men who worked, struggled, and survived in a world that offered them little beyond hardship. Ultimately, the truth about cowboys shatters the image of the Wild West hero. They were young, poor, often marginalized, and subjected to grueling labor, constant danger, and short lives. Their courage and skill were undeniable, but it was a courage born out of necessity, not glory. The cowboy's life was defined by endurance, resilience, and the relentless demands of a brutal, unforgiving frontier. When we strip away the myths and legends, the romantic image fades, leaving behind the real story. Cowboys were ordinary men living extraordinary, often deadly, circumstances. They did not ride endlessly into adventure, they survived, day by day, on a land that demanded everything and gave almost nothing in return. When we think of the Wild West, women rarely come to mind. Pop culture often reduces them to saloons, dresses, and damsels in distress, but the reality was far harsher, and far more complex. Frontier women were not passive observers of history, they were survivors, laborers, pioneers, and sometimes, the backbone of entire communities. Their lives were filled with toil, danger, and unrelenting hardship, often overshadowed by the violence, disease, and lawlessness that defined the era. For most women, life was an unending struggle. Domestic labor consumed every waking hour, and it was far more physically demanding than the images of genteel housewives in novels suggest. Chores included fetching water from distant wells, chopping firewood, tending gardens, preparing meals over open fires, and washing clothes by hand, often in freezing rivers or muddy streams. Each task was exhausting, repetitive, and crucial for survival. A mistake could lead to illness, starvation, or the death of a family member. Pregnancy and childbirth were among the most dangerous experiences a woman could face. Without doctors or hospitals, women gave birth at home, often assisted by midwives with limited experience. Complications were common, and both maternal and infant mortality rates were devastatingly high. In some settlements, nearly 1 in 10 women died in childbirth, and many newborns never survived their first year. Pain, infection, and despair were constant companions, shaping the lives of women in ways rarely portrayed in romanticized accounts of the West. Some women found themselves working outside the home simply to survive. Many became prostitutes or saloon girls, often under coercive circumstances or economic necessity. The saloon culture of the West was dangerous. Long hours, sexual exploitation, violence, and substance abuse were routine. Women working in these environments walked a thin line between survival and victimhood, with few legal protections and little societal support. Yet, they were also shrewd, resourceful, and capable of wielding influence within their communities, whether through business, social networks, or sheer determination. Other women took on roles that defied traditional gender norms. Some ran homesteads alone after losing husbands to violence or disease. Others became ranchers, sharpshooters, or law enforcers, demonstrating courage and skill in environments that often considered them expendable. Figures like Calamity Jane and Annie Oakley were exceptional, but they highlight a broader truth: women were capable of resilience and bravery that rivaled any cowboy or outlaw. Violence did not spare women. Domestic abuse, sexual assault, and harassment were rampant. Isolated homesteads made women vulnerable to criminals, outlaws, and occasionally even neighbors. The law rarely intervened. Sheriffs and marshals were often more concerned with protecting property or men of influence than safeguarding women. For many, survival required constant vigilance, quick thinking, and the ability to defend themselves with whatever means were available. Food preparation, childcare, and daily labor were all physically grueling, yet women also faced the emotional burden of loss. Disease, accidents, and violence claimed family members with startling frequency. Children were born into a world where death was a constant presence, and women bore the dual responsibility of nurturing life while preparing for its fragility. They mourned silently and continued to work tirelessly, often without acknowledgement or support. Despite these hardships, frontier women created communities and support networks. They shared resources, knowledge, and labor, forming informal systems of mutual aid that helped families survive. They taught one another herbal remedies, farming techniques, and child-rearing strategies in a world where formal education and medical care were scarce. These networks were lifelines, especially for widows or single mothers, and they exemplified the resilience and ingenuity required to endure frontier life. Education was another battleground. Many women valued literacy and learning, establishing schools in settlements where formal education was otherwise unavailable. Teaching was often combined with domestic labor and farm work, meaning that women carried double burdens. The sacrifices they made to educate children, particularly daughters, were monumental, yet rarely celebrated in the historical record. In towns with saloons and gambling halls, women had to navigate complex social hierarchies. Respectability could be a matter of survival. Reputation mattered, yet it could also be a trap. A single rumor or accusation could lead to ostracization, violence, or economic ruin. Survival often depended on pragmatism, wit, and resilience, qualities that required constant vigilance and adaptability. Some women even wielded power in the shadows of male-dominated societies. Matriarchs of homesteads controlled household economies, negotiated with neighbors and traders, and ensured that families had what they needed to survive harsh winters and poor harvests. These women were unsung strategists, balancing the immediate demands of survival with long-term planning in an environment that offered no margin for error. The reality of women's lives in the Wild West shatters any romantic notions of carefree adventure. Their daily existence was a battle, waged against disease, exhaustion, social constraints, and constant danger. Yet, within this brutality, frontier women displayed ingenuity, strength, and courage that allowed families and communities to endure in one of the harshest environments in American history. In the end, the stories of women reveal a Wild West that is far more complicated than legends suggest. It wasn't just cowboys, guns, and outlaws, it was a landscape shaped by the labor, resilience, and courage of women, who fought daily for survival, dignity, and hope in a world determined to strip them of both. Their stories remind us that the true frontier wasn't merely a matter of geography, it was a test of endurance, adaptability, and unyielding spirit. The story of the Wild West is often told from the perspective of settlers, cowboys, and outlaws, but one of the most brutal and overlooked truths is the experience of Native Americans. For centuries, these indigenous peoples had thrived across the plains, deserts, and forests of North America, with rich cultures, traditions, and deep knowledge of the land. Yet the westward expansion of settlers brought displacement, violence, and devastation, transforming the West into a landscape of tragedy for Native communities. Settlers moving west often ignored treaties, stolen lands, and centuries of indigenous occupation. The arrival of railroads, miners, and homesteaders disrupted hunting grounds, destroyed sacred sites, and forced Native Americans into unfamiliar territories. The government's policy of forced relocation, including infamous programs like the Trail of Tears, uprooted entire tribes. Families were marched across hundreds of miles, often without adequate food, shelter, or protection, resulting in starvation, disease, and death. Conflict was inevitable. Native Americans resisted encroachment in whatever ways they could, from raids on isolated settlements to attacks on wagon trains. These actions were framed by settlers and later by history as savagery, but in truth, they were acts of survival and defense of homeland. Settlers often underestimated the organization, skill, and resilience of indigenous warriors, who knew the land intimately and could strike with precision and speed. Violence escalated quickly and brutally. Massacres, retaliatory attacks, and skirmishes became commonplace. Towns and forts were sometimes raided, leaving settlers dead or captured, while military campaigns against native populations often targeted women, children, and the elderly. The U.S. Army waged campaigns designed to crush entire communities, and battlefields often became scenes of horror, with bodies left unburied and survivors driven from their homes. The myth of the cowboys versus Indians battle simplifies a much more complex reality. Many native tribes sought peace, trade, or coexistence, yet the expansionist mindset of settlers and government officials left little room for compromise. When resistance occurred, it was met with overwhelming force, often disproportionate to the threat posed. Small villages could be destroyed in retaliation for minor raids or misunderstandings, creating a cycle of violence that seemed unending. Life on reservations was no reprieve. Native Americans were often forced onto arid, unproductive lands, far from the rivers, forests, or hunting grounds they depended on. Food shortages were severe, and starvation was common. Diseases brought by settlers, such as smallpox, influenza, and cholera, devastated communities already weakened by displacement. The social and cultural fabric of tribes was shredded, leaving scars that persist to this day. Children and women suffered immensely during this period. Families were torn apart by violence or forced marches. Young boys were sometimes recruited to fight or serve as scouts, while girls faced exploitation and the constant threat of abuse. The disruption of daily life destroyed traditional roles, ceremonies, and education. Survival demanded adaptation, yet every step forward was shadowed by loss, grief, and relentless oppression. The psychological impact of these conflicts cannot be overstated. Generations of Native Americans lived under constant fear of attack, coercion, or starvation. Elders struggled to pass down knowledge and tradition in an environment that punished cultural continuity. The trauma of witnessing violence, losing loved ones, and being forcibly removed from sacred lands shaped entire communities, leaving a legacy that echoed long after the frontier era ended. Settler narratives often painted Native Americans as obstacles to progress, erasing the violence and betrayal inflicted upon them. Historical accounts glossed over massacres, forced relocations, and broken treaties, instead romanticizing westward expansion as the triumph of civilization over wilderness. Yet the reality was stark: indigenous populations were decimated, their sovereignty ignored, and their survival repeatedly threatened. Even when treaties were signed, they were rarely honored. Land promised to native tribes was seized, sometimes under the guise of legal technicalities or manufactured claims. Settlers moved in, established farms, mines, and towns, and left native communities to adapt to an ever-shrinking world. Resistance was met with retaliation, legal manipulation, and military campaigns designed to eradicate opposition. The law was wielded selectively, favoring settlers while punishing those defending their homes. This brutal cycle of displacement and violence created long-term social and cultural disruption. Tribes were fragmented, languages and traditions threatened, and communities forced into dependency on government rations. The West, as settlers saw it, became open for exploitation, but for Native Americans, it was a landscape of suffering, resistance, and survival against impossible odds. Yet, even in the darkest moments, indigenous resilience endured. Tribes adapted, negotiated, and fought to preserve their culture, even under relentless pressure. Stories of courage, ingenuity, and survival abound, men and women defending their families, elders teaching traditions in secret, and communities finding ways to endure despite starvation, disease, and military oppression. These stories are often overlooked in popular history but are essential to understanding the true complexity of the Wild West. The conflict between settlers and Native Americans reminds us that the Wild West was not simply a playground for cowboys and outlaws. It was a contested land, a battlefield, and a site of cultural devastation. The violence, betrayal, and displacement inflicted on native populations represent one of the most brutal truths of frontier history. While films and novels glorify gunfights and daring escapes, the reality for indigenous communities was far grimmer, a struggle to survive in a world increasingly hostile to their existence. In the end, examining Native Americans' experiences in the Wild West forces a reassessment of the era. The frontier was not simply about opportunity or adventure, it was a land of conquest, survival, and systemic injustice. Understanding this perspective challenges the myths we have inherited and highlights the courage, suffering, and resilience of indigenous peoples who endured a period that sought to erase them entirely from the landscape they had called home for centuries. Life in the Wild West was not just a battle against disease, violence, and harsh living conditions, it was also a battle against boredom, isolation, and despair. For many settlers, cowboys, and townsfolk, saloons offered an escape. They were a place of temporary relief, a social hub, and sometimes the only form of entertainment available for hundreds of miles. But behind the swinging doors and the cheerful clinking of glasses lay a far darker reality: addiction, ruin, and violence that often escalated to deadly consequences. Alcohol flowed freely in frontier towns, often cheap, potent, and poorly regulated. Whiskey, rum, and homemade spirits could be stronger than most modern liquors, and a single night of drinking could quickly turn deadly. Saloons were packed with men desperate to forget the harsh realities of life: long days of grueling labor, harsh weather, and the constant threat of violence. Drinking became a temporary reprieve, but for many, it was the start of a spiral into dependency and destruction. Gambling was another cornerstone of frontier culture. Poker, faro, and blackjack were played in every saloon, hotel, and makeshift gambling hall. A hand of cards could determine wealth, pride, or life itself. Men bet what little they had, risking wages, livestock, or even land. Cheating was common, tempers flared, and disputes often ended in gunfire or fistfights. The line between entertainment and survival blurred. Losing a bet could ruin a family financially, while winning could mark a man as a target for thieves or rivals. The combination of alcohol and gambling created a toxic social environment. Intoxicated men became reckless, violent, and impulsive. Saloon brawls erupted over minor insults, spilled drinks, or perceived slights. Knives flashed, revolvers were drawn, and sometimes, these disputes ended with death. Even lawmen were not immune. Sheriffs and deputies frequented the same saloons, and alcohol-fueled decisions sometimes led to corruption, brutality, or unjust killings. Addiction was common, yet misunderstood. Medical knowledge of substance abuse was virtually non-existent. Whiskey and opium were sometimes sold as remedies for pain, illness, or insomnia, creating a dangerous dependency. Men and women alike became trapped in cycles of self-medication, using alcohol or drugs to cope with physical pain, emotional trauma, or the crushing monotony of frontier life. Once addicted, options were limited, and recovery was almost impossible. Women, too, were affected by the culture of drinking and gambling. Many were forced to rely on men who spent their meager earnings on liquor and cards, leaving families struggling to survive. Others worked in saloons as bartenders, cooks, or entertainers, exposed to the constant temptation and chaos of alcohol-fueled violence. Some became dependent themselves, using alcohol or opium to escape exhaustion, grief, or abuse. The social consequences were staggering. Families were torn apart by addiction and debt. Marriages ended, children were neglected, and homes were abandoned. Entire communities could be destabilized by widespread drinking and gambling. Towns with booming saloon cultures often reported higher levels of crime, prostitution, and violence. Addiction was not a private matter, it was a public threat, affecting the fabric of frontier society. Saloons also served as breeding grounds for crime. Gamblers, con artists, and outlaws frequented these establishments, preying on the desperate and the unwary. Pickpocketing, cheating, and robbery were common. A man could walk into a saloon seeking camaraderie or fun and leave beaten, robbed, or dead. The line between recreation and danger was razor thin, and few ever walked away unscathed. Despite the risks, saloons were vital social hubs. They provided news, a chance to connect with others, and brief moments of camaraderie in an otherwise isolated world. But these fleeting joys came at a cost. Addiction, violence, and debt were constant threats, and even the strongest men could be undone in a single night. The frontier, after all, was not forgiving of weakness, whether in the face of nature, disease, or personal vice. Alcohol and gambling also had cultural consequences. They reinforced a rugged, reckless masculinity celebrated in frontier mythology. The image of the hard-drinking, gunslinging cowboy or outlaw was born from reality, yet it obscured the suffering and destruction behind the myth. Men often equated drinking and gambling with status or toughness, masking fear, loneliness, and vulnerability. It was a dangerous performance, one that often ended in tragedy. Opium and patent medicines added another layer of peril. Sold as remedies for everything from pain to insomnia, they often contained addictive substances, leaving settlers dependent and weakened. What was marketed as a cure frequently became another form of suffering, compounding the physical and emotional toll of frontier life. The harsh truth is that vice was a survival mechanism as much as it was a threat. Settlers, cowboys, and townsfolk turned to alcohol, gambling, and drugs to endure the relentless hardships of frontier existence. But these temporary escapes came with long-term consequences. Death, violence, and broken families were the price paid for moments of relief, highlighting a darker, often overlooked reality of life in the Wild West. In the end, alcohol, gambling, and addiction were more than social habits, they were tools of survival in a brutal, unforgiving world, and yet they were also destructive forces that undermined the very communities that relied on them. They reveal a Wild West defined not just by heroism and adventure, but by human frailty, desperation, and the cost of seeking escape in a world that offered few reprieves. The Wild West is synonymous with outlaws, gunfights, and the constant tension between law and chaos. From Jesse James to Billy the Kid, the stories of outlaws have captured imaginations for generations. But beneath the romanticized tales lies a far darker reality, a world where crime, betrayal, and sudden death were everyday dangers, and the line between hero and villain was almost always blurred. Outlaws were not cinematic antiheroes, they were often desperate men and women, shaped by poverty, opportunity, and circumstance. Economic hardship drove many to robbery, theft, and violence. Banks, trains, and stagecoaches were not just lucrative targets, they were symbols of authority and wealth that ordinary settlers could never access. Crime became both survival and rebellion, a means of asserting power in a world that offered few options for the marginalized. Gunfights, unlike the staged duels of films, were chaotic and deadly affairs. Rarely did two men face off at high noon with an expectant crowd. Most shootings were ambushes, confrontations in dark alleys, or explosions of violence following arguments, betrayal, or law enforcement pursuit. A single wrong move, a misheard word, or a panicked reflex could mean death. Outlaws lived under constant threat, not only from the law but from rivals, partners, and their own reckless choices. Infamous gunfights became the stuff of legend, yet the reality was far bloodier and more indiscriminate than history books often suggest. The gunfight at the O.K. Corral, for example, lasted less than a minute, but in that brief moment, 6 men were shot, 3 of whom died. Chaos, fear, and noise defined the encounter far more than any sense of honor or skill. Bystanders often scrambled for cover, and bullets rarely went where they were intended. Legends sanitized the horror, but eyewitness accounts describe panic, confusion, and screams, far from a choreographed showdown. Outlaws also operated in complex networks of loyalty and betrayal. Partnerships could dissolve with deadly consequences. Rival gangs competed for territory, resources, and influence, often settling disputes with bullets rather than negotiation. Even within gangs, mistrust was common, with betrayals leading to ambushes, murders, or arrests. Survival required cunning, vigilance, and an ability to anticipate threats from every angle. A single misstep could be fatal, and loyalty was often temporary. The law was inconsistent, corrupt, or absent in many areas, creating fertile ground for outlaw activity. Sheriffs and marshals often had limited manpower and faced immense risks in enforcing order. Sometimes, lawmen colluded with criminals, turning a blind eye for bribes or personal gain. Other times, they pursued justice relentlessly, leading to dramatic confrontations that ended with bodies on the street or in the dirt. The blurred line between criminal and enforcer added to the lawlessness, making trust a rare commodity. Travel was hazardous for ordinary settlers as well. Stagecoaches, trains, and wagon trains were frequent targets for robberies. Travelers carried cash, gold, or other valuables, and outlaws were often patient, calculating, and ruthless. A lone traveler or a poorly defended convoy could face armed ambushes with little chance of escape. Violence was sudden and indiscriminate, leaving survivors traumatized and often destitute. Some outlaws gained notoriety not just for their crimes, but for their sheer audacity. Jesse James robbed banks and trains with bold precision, but his legend obscures the deaths he left in his wake. Billy the Kid, romanticized as a young gunslinger, killed men in cold blood and evaded the law through cunning and speed. The mythology of outlaws often emphasizes charm or skill, but the historical reality highlights fear, cruelty, and relentless danger. Gunfights were also influenced by environment and circumstance. Narrow streets, saloons, and open plains all affected how confrontations unfolded. Cowboys, lawmen, and outlaws alike had to rely on keen observation, instinct, and lightning reflexes. Yet even the most skilled gunmen were vulnerable to accidents, misfires, and the unpredictable chaos of human panic. Legends often omit these mundane, terrifying realities, replacing them with tales of heroism and honor. Violence extended beyond the immediate gunfight. Retaliation was a constant reality, as family members, gang members, or lawmen sought revenge. Feuds could last years, with every encounter carrying the potential for bloodshed. Settlements lived under a shadow of fear, knowing that a single encounter with the wrong outlaw could have repercussions that lasted a lifetime. Ordinary citizens were often caught in the crossfire, their lives altered irrevocably by a world they could neither control nor escape. Death in the Wild West was sudden, often gruesome, and rarely noble. Outlaws met violent ends, shot by rivals, betrayed by allies, or executed by the law. Lawmen too faced sudden, brutal deaths in the line of duty. Life expectancy for those engaged in outlawry was short, and the notion of living to old age was a rare exception. The frontier exacted a heavy toll on all who embraced violence, whether for survival, profit, or notoriety. Yet, despite the danger, the mythology of the outlaw grew, fueled by newspapers, dime novels, and later films. Tales of daring robberies, narrow escapes, and dramatic showdowns captivated audiences far from the frontier, turning criminals into anti-heroes. In reality, these stories concealed the fear, bloodshed, and unpredictability that defined daily life in outlaw country. Romance and adventure masked a world governed by death, betrayal, and desperation. Ultimately, the truth about outlaws and gunfights is clear: the Wild West was a landscape of chaos, opportunity, and mortal risk. Gunfighters were not heroes, they were survivors, criminals, and occasionally, victims of circumstance. Their stories reveal a world where violence was omnipresent, trust was scarce, and every encounter carried the potential for fatal consequences. To understand the West, we must look past the legends and see the harsh, bloody reality beneath the myth. The Wild West is often romanticized as a place where lawmen upheld justice with courage and precision, standing between chaos and civilization. Yet the reality was far murkier. Sheriffs, marshals, and deputies were human, flawed, and often stretched beyond their means. The line between justice and corruption was thin, and the law itself was a fragile shield in a world dominated by violence, greed, and survival. Lawmen were often outnumbered and outgunned. Frontier towns were scattered across vast, unforgiving landscapes, and a single sheriff might be responsible for hundreds of square miles. Communication was slow, backup was rare, and criminals could disappear into the wilderness with ease. One wrong judgment or delayed action could mean a massacre, a robbery, or the escape of a notorious outlaw. The pressure on these men was immense, and mistakes were often fatal. Corruption was rampant. Some sheriffs and deputies collaborated with criminals for personal gain, taking bribes to ignore illegal activity or actively participating in robberies. Others tolerated vice, gambling, prostitution, and alcohol sales, because towns relied on them economically. Enforcement was selective, often favoring those with wealth, influence, or connections. The law could be an instrument of power rather than justice, and the people who depended on it were often left vulnerable. Even honest lawmen faced nearly impossible odds. Arresting dangerous criminals required courage and skill, yet miscalculations could be deadly. Gunfights erupted with little warning, and a single misstep could end in death or severe injury. Many lawmen carried the heavy burden of knowing that their presence alone might not prevent violence, and that the legal system offered little support or protection. Life on the frontier demanded constant vigilance, strategic thinking, and often, brutal pragmatism. Justice itself was inconsistent. Trials were rare, evidence was scarce, and jury pools were often biased or uninformed. Punishments ranged from fines to public hangings, but the law was frequently arbitrary. Outlaws could escape prosecution due to sympathetic witnesses, bribes, or simple lack of resources to pursue a case. Conversely, the innocent could be accused, tried, and punished with minimal evidence. The judicial system was fragile, often reflecting the chaos and moral ambiguity of frontier life. Town politics added another layer of complexity. Local officials had to balance enforcing the law with keeping economic and social peace. Saloons, mines, and railroads were vital to survival, yet they were often hotbeds of crime. A sheriff who disrupted business too aggressively could face backlash from citizens, merchants, or even fellow lawmen. Maintaining order required negotiation, compromise, and at times, turning a blind eye to maintain stability. The iconic duel at high noon is largely myth. Confrontations between lawmen and criminals were usually unpredictable, violent, and messy. Ambushes, sudden shootouts, and chaotic chases were the norm. Lawmen had to anticipate deception, act decisively under extreme stress, and often make life-or-death decisions in seconds. Their work demanded courage, yet it was far more dangerous and complex than the legends portray. Lawmen were also responsible for protecting vulnerable populations, including women, children, and settlers isolated in remote homesteads. Yet even these duties were perilous. Many crimes went unpunished simply because pursuing justice meant risking life and limb. A sheriff could respond to a call for help only to discover a murder had already occurred. The Wild West did not forgive hesitation, and the consequences of failure were immediate and often tragic. Corruption intertwined with heroism in complex ways. Figures like Wyatt Earp, Pat Garrett, and Bat Masterson became legends not only for their courage but also for navigating the ambiguous moral terrain of the frontier. They upheld the law where possible but sometimes compromised it strategically, balancing survival, public perception, and practical necessity. The boundary between right and wrong was blurred, and the lawmen who survived the frontier were those who could operate effectively within its shadows. The justice system's limitations also fueled cycles of revenge. Outlaws sought retribution against lawmen who arrested or pursued them, while families of victims often took the law into their own hands. Feuds could last for years, escalating violence and undermining community stability. In this world, survival often depended more on shrewd judgment and calculated action than on morality or virtue. Ultimately, the reality of lawmen in the Wild West reveals a world far removed from simple heroism. The law was fragile, enforcement inconsistent, and corruption pervasive. Towns depended on lawmen for protection, yet those same lawmen had to navigate an environment of greed, danger, and moral ambiguity. Survival required not just courage and skill but also pragmatism, intuition, and a willingness to operate in gray areas where justice and corruption overlapped. The story of lawmen reminds us that the Wild West was not a tidy world of heroes and villains. It was a chaotic, unpredictable environment where the law existed as both a tool and a limitation. The men and women enforcing justice walked a razor's edge, balancing morality, survival, and the needs of their communities. Their legacy is a testament to the complexity, danger, and human frailty that defined frontier life, a world where courage was necessary, but it was never enough to guarantee safety or fairness. While tales of outlaws, gunfights, and lawmen dominate the mythology of the Wild West, the daily reality for most settlers was far less glamorous and far more grueling. Frontier towns were hubs of commerce, social interaction, and survival, but they were also places of constant danger, disease, and deprivation. The streets were bustling, yet precarious, where life and death coexisted, and every day demanded vigilance, endurance, and resilience. Most frontier towns were hastily built, often from wood planks salvaged from nearby forests or rail shipments. Buildings were close together, creating narrow, dusty streets that became mud baths during rains or clouds of choking dust in the summer. Saloons, general stores, blacksmith shops, and churches formed the skeleton of the town, but sanitation was virtually non-existent. Waste, refuse, and animals mingled freely, making disease outbreaks a persistent and deadly threat. Settlers lived, worked, and played amid flies, vermin, and filth, with minimal protection from infection. Commerce in these towns was as unpredictable as it was essential. General stores offered basic necessities, often at inflated prices, and goods were limited to what could be transported over long distances. Residents bartered, traded, and improvised constantly. For many families, survival depended on skillful negotiation, thrift, and resourcefulness. Every meal, piece of clothing, and tool carried the weight of hard labor and limited supply. Even minor setbacks, a failed harvest, a missed delivery, or theft, could have catastrophic consequences. Social life was both a refuge and a risk. Townsfolk gathered in saloons, churches, or public squares to exchange news, gossip, or small pleasures. Music, dancing, and games provided brief relief from hardship, yet these spaces were also breeding grounds for conflict. Alcohol-fueled arguments often escalated into fights, and disputes could turn deadly with a gun or knife. Even socializing required caution. A friendly face could quickly become a threat. Children experienced frontier life differently, yet no less harshly. Education was limited, with one-room schoolhouses serving multiple grades, often taught by overworked and underprepared teachers. Work began early. Children fetched water, tended animals, or helped in fields and workshops. Play was brief, often dangerous, and frequently interrupted by the demands of survival. Childhood was shorter and harsher than modern audiences might imagine, with lessons in endurance, responsibility, and practical skill learned at a very young age. Health and hygiene were constant challenges. Diseases like smallpox, cholera, influenza, and dysentery were common and deadly. Medical care was rudimentary, doctors were scarce, supplies limited, and knowledge minimal. Settlers relied on herbal remedies, midwives, or sheer luck, often facing death from infections that today would be easily treated. The ever-present threat of illness added tension to daily life, and communities were deeply affected by sudden outbreaks. Work in frontier towns was relentless. Men labored in construction, mining, ranching, or transport, while women handled domestic duties, childcare, and farm labor. Every household contributed to survival, and idleness was a luxury none could afford. Even in moments of rest, people remained alert. Attacks, accidents, and environmental hazards could strike without warning. Life demanded constant effort, endurance, and ingenuity. Religion and superstition played roles in shaping town culture. Churches offered spiritual guidance and a sense of community, while folk remedies, charms, and superstition filled gaps in medical knowledge. These beliefs provided comfort and structure in a world defined by chaos and unpredictability. Yet superstition could also lead to misguided decisions, from treatment of disease to judgment in disputes, reflecting the uncertainty and vulnerability inherent in frontier life. Communication with the outside world was slow and unreliable. Mail, telegraphs, and newspapers connected townsfolk to larger events, but delays were frequent. News traveled slowly, and rumors often filled the void, sometimes causing unnecessary panic or false hope. Families relied on letters and travelers to maintain bonds with distant relatives, making information precious and highly valued. Isolation intensified the psychological burden of frontier life. Crime and moral ambiguity were everyday realities. Theft, scams, and cheating were common, and settlers had to remain vigilant even among neighbors. Law enforcement was limited, meaning communities often enforced justice informally or through self-help. Vigilante justice was frequent, sometimes brutal, and often fueled by fear, revenge, or necessity. Settlers learned quickly that survival required not just labor and endurance but shrewd judgment and strategic caution. Despite these hardships, frontier towns were also places of resilience, innovation, and community. Residents adapted to extreme conditions, creating practical solutions for water, food, and shelter. Markets, schools, and social networks evolved to meet the challenges of daily life. Festivals, fairs, and public gatherings offered brief moments of joy, fostering a sense of identity and belonging. The towns were living testaments to human ingenuity, endurance, and the will to survive in a harsh, unpredictable environment. In essence, everyday life in frontier towns was a delicate balance of survival, social interaction, and adaptation. It was a world where comfort was fleeting, danger was omnipresent, and the boundaries between life and death were fragile. The day-to-day experiences of settlers were shaped by relentless labor, environmental hazards, disease, and the constant presence of moral and physical threats. Yet, amid the dust, hardship, and uncertainty, communities endured, demonstrating the resilience, creativity, and courage required to thrive in one of the harshest frontiers in history.